Okay, welcome to this year's annual Belk lecture in botany. Our guest this year is Dr. Andrew Hipp, now who's going to be talking about oak origins. But I'm going to leave the introductions for Andrew to Dr. Fisk, and I am going to be talking about introducing you to Ethel Belk, the name, who give you a little bit of information about Ethel Belk. Now, before I move on, just a few notes. There's going to be another seminar. Dr. Hipp will give us a seminar at 4:15 p.m. tomorrow in 218 Pearson. This is part of the normal biology seminar series. And also a reminder that there is a reception and through these double doors after the talk. So don't be too hasty. Make sure you go out those doors, and there's going to be lots of treats and some chit chat, and you can talk and meet with Andrew as well after the talk. Okay. So first, who was Ethel Belk? Ethel Belk was one bad mother. Shut your mouth. I'm just talking about Ethel Belk. Who gets that reference? Yes. Yes, Nate, very good. So this is Ethel Belk, and you can tell Ethel Belk meant business. So all y'all in my classes who think I mean business, Ethel Belk meant business. Ethel Belk taught botany from 1929 to 1968 at Miami University. She was born in Henry, South Dakota, and basically came to Oxford, and that's where she lived until 1990. She got her MS from South Dakota State University on the origins of adventitious roots and coleus, which we still study today in our anatomy labs. Woo! Maybe not that paper, but we did study coleus roots. And then she did her PhD studying the morphology and anatomy of the graminae, the flowers in the graminae, which are the grasses. And I hear that to be an expert in grasses is a truly remarkable skill. And you have to be a little bit crazy to be interested in grasses so much, don't you, Gretchen? We have another expert in our current herbarium curator is an expert in grasses. Back in the day, I want all the students to look at this. This is how you dressed. I don't even dress that way now, and I'm a faculty, all right? But this is Ethel Belk in the classroom with the finely dressed young ladies and men of her class. And she had a really big impact on botany at Miami University. The department goes back all the way to 1806. But she came in, and so this is her, and this is the Department of Botany and Bacteriology, also known as microbiology, back in the 1930s. This is the departmental head, Dr. Stark. She wrote the manuals for introductory botany classes. She basically taught every single botany class to the students, so the students got to know her really well, more than any other professor. During World War II, she taught radio to naval students. She helped build up the herbarium collection and trained generations of leading botanists. I also hear that she introduced the Amer honeysuckle to Oxford. Yay! Curly, a big invasive, but hey, can't all be perfect. And as a result of her impact on botany, actually, she was honored by a resolution passed by the Ohio Senate. This is for a botanist in 1986 for her outstanding contributions to botany. Right? Yeah, big deal. Now, you can still see some of her legacy in the Belk greenhouse, which is named after her. And I've been told that next year we will have a much better slide rather than this one that was pulled off the interwebs 20 years ago that will really showcase the inside of the Belk greenhouse. So that's forthcoming. That's next year. Okay. So without further ado, I get to introduce Dr. Melanie Fisk, who gets to introduce our speaker for tonight. And you get the thing.
I don't think so. All right. Great. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce the Belk lecture speaker, Dr. Andrew Hipp, an accomplished plant systematist and evolutionary biologist at the Morton Arboretum, who's here tonight to tell us his story about the origins and successes of oaks, one of the most widespread, species-rich, and functionally important genera in North American forests. Dr. Hipp started his academic career in the unique Wildland Studies program in 1991 and moved on to complete his undergraduate degree in English and creative writing at the University of Madison, Wisconsin in 1994. He remained in Madison as a naturalist at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum and also as a naturalist at the Preschool for the Arts in Madison until he later completed his PhD in 2004 in botany at the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Hipp then moved on to the Morton Arboretum in Chicago, where he became the herbarium curator and a research scientist in plant systematics. He's been at the Morton Arboretum since then and is currently the director of the herbarium and the lead scientist in plant systematics. While he's been at the Morton Arboretum, he's developed a substantial and widely collaborative research program focusing on the diversification and evolution of plant lineages. And he addresses foundational questions about plant diversity, about past and potential for future adaptability to changing environments, often with implications for conservation. Much of that work is focused on the oaks, which we'll hear about today. Dr. Hipp has also worked on phylogeny of Carex. And as someone who used to map wetlands as a consultant, I admire anyone who understands anything about Carex. But and his work also addresses questions in restoration science, integrating his expertise in evolutionary biology and community ecology to examine contributions of phylogenetic diversity in addition to species diversity, contributions to restoration success in terms of the resilience and the functioning of restored ecosystems. So Dr. Hipp's contributions include authorship on almost 150 peer-reviewed publications, publication of multiple book chapters, and a recent book on the origin of oaks. He's received consistent and substantial funding from NSF and USDA and also from other sources, including JGI recently. And he's also received 2 Fulbright Awards for conducting his work and is currently the president of the American Society of Plant Taxonomists. So it's a real treat to be able to hear Dr. Hipp's story of the oaks tonight in his talk, The Oak Origins from Acorns to Species and the Tree of Life. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Hipp. Let's see if I can break this while I'm trying to. There's that.
Thank you for that. Okay, here we go. Is that plugged in? Is that okay? Okay, well, thank you for that. Really, thank you very much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you all for being here tonight. I am excited to and honored to be to have been invited to speak with you tonight about oaks. These lights are coming and going. This is a group I love, and it's really exciting to be able to talk with you about them tonight because oaks are a really familiar group for all of us. We all feel like we know them. They're these woody plants that range from mammoth, like the bur oak here in Middle Fork Savannah near where I live, or ranging down to just ankle high, like this Quercus striatula in the Sierra Madre Occidental of Mexico. But they're always woody plants. They've always got clustered end buds like you see in black oak here. This is from Hill Arboretum. But black oak you probably know from around here as well, with these distinctive hairy buds, so much hair on them you can hardly see the surface of the scales, clustered at the ends of the branches. One of the things that makes an oak. These wind-borne pollen born in catkins, these dangling inflorescences strewn with male flowers that hang off the tips of the branches like tinsel in early spring. And finally, the acorns, right? If you add that combination of characteristics anywhere in the world, you know you have an oak. But that's not all that oaks are. Oaks are, I was warned not to touch any other buttons. Okay, see if can you help me? Thank you. Oaks are far more than just these characteristics, right? Oaks are individuals. We all know some great big oak we love. Oaks are populations or species that are knowable. We know a black oak, whether we see it in Pennsylvania or the driftless area, Wisconsin, or downstate Illinois. And they're a sprig of the tree of life. Right, 425 species that range from China to Peoria to California to Mexico. They're all of these things all at once. And when I walk through the forest, I see them as all these at once. So my wife, Rachel Davis, who illustrated the book, and I wrote this as a portrait of oak natural history, evolution, and ecology from these different angles, with the hopes that when you walk through the woods, you also experience oaks as these multifarious creatures that they are, as we do. I was warned not to do that. Okay, thank you. I'm trying not to. So in this talk, this is the table of contents of oak origins. I'm going to be focusing on three aspects that correlate roughly with three chapters. First, asking the questions how oaks mate and move around, this basic natural history that makes oaks what they are. Then oaks, how they evolved, where and when, because it's that evolution of oaks that puts them into forest communities that we know today. And finally, this question about how that oak evolution actually shaped the forest and how the organisms that depend on oaks have evolved in response to oaks. We'll focus on these three aspects of oak ecology and natural history tonight, beginning with how oaks mate and move around. We're really talking here about reproduction, dispersal, migration, which begins in the spring. When buds, this is larger than life size, this is a Hills oak, when the buds first open and you see leaf tips just poking out of the tip of the end bud, and out of the side are coming the male inflorescences, the catkins or aments. As the leaves expand just a little bit more, this is the same day and the same stand, but a branch that's just a little bit further along. By the time the leaves are about the size of a mouse's ear, these catkins begin to droop, and then they expand and extend, and what you see along them are these little clusters of flowers. What the catkins are is the male inflorescences. So if you look at them close, get up close with your camera or a hand lens, what you find on each of these catkins are clusters of anthers. These look like hot dog buns annealed lengthwise. These are what produce the pollen. They're born in little bouquets of staminate flowers. And those flowers that are born together along these strand-like things, these are called the catkins or the aments. When you see those coming out, you know spring is really underway. Inside each one of those anthers, right? Those little things at the ends of the at the ends of the filaments, they're pollen sacs. Each of those pollen sacs, one for each of the little hot dog bun-like things, holds a lot of pollen mother cells. Each stamen can produce anywhere from 1,700 to 7,000 or more pollen grains. That's a really wide range. It's probably even wider than that, but nobody does these studies because nobody wants to count all the pollen grains. At maturity, these anthers open up and the pollen grains fly. What you're looking at is a white oak, just a portion of the male flower. You're looking at the anther here, borne on the filaments, that whole thing together, pollen spilling out of the side, that whole thing there is called the stamen. When temperatures are warm enough and humidity is dry enough, the pollen can fly 100 meters, 500 meters, 30 kilometers, 80 kilometers. The farthest pollination we know of from a male flower here to a female flower over there is 80 kilometers, and there's estimates that it could go even further. The lion's share of the pollinations happen within a few hundred meters, though. Anthers empty out in a few hours to a few days, provided the temperatures are high enough and humidity is low enough. If it's a cool, damp spring, all the anthers can be killed. At the same time, the stigmas of the pistillate or female flowers become receptive in time to catch the pollen. This is a magnified pistillate flower. What you're looking at here is 3 stigmas. 1, 2, 3. Each of those stigmas is sticky to catch pollen that's flying on the wind. Pollen flies, lands on the stigmatic surface, and when it lands there, the stigma stimulates the pollen grain, and the pollen grain begins to grow a tube. That pollen tube carries the sperm cell down towards the ovule. So if you look at this blown up, here's just a diagram of a pistillate flower with room for 15, 20 pollen grains to land on each stigmatic surface. Those pollen grains grow down through the style. Here they are competing in the style. They're racing to get down to the ovules, which are right here. So if you do a longitudinal section through this flower, it looks a little bit like this. This is a pistillate flower. It's a baby acorn, right? This is the acorn cap wrapped around it. It's growing inside there. The pollen tubes grow down like this. If you cut across this way, you get a cross section that looks like that. You can see there's 6 ovules inside each pistillate flower. Each of those could potentially become a seed, but only one of them generally does. Because when the pollen gets down here and reaches one of these ovules, once one ovule is fertilized, typically all the other 5 ovules abort, usually, which is why you usually only find 1-seeded acorns. But every once in a while, you do find a 2-seeded acorn, like this white oak that I found out in Maple Grove Forest Preserve near my home. It was growing in the ground. I picked it out. I said, it looks like 4 cotyledons, these little seed leaves that are packed inside the acorn. In fact, that's exactly what they were. They're 2 seeds that were growing inside one acorn, growing next to each other. You're like, so Andrew, why don't acorns always do that? They could get 2 for the price of 1, right? Why don't they always make 2-seeded acorns? Because those 2 seeds compete against each other. When you've got, in Quercus macrocarpa, bur oak, the one study that I've seen where they actually looked at the effect of these 2-seeded acorns on their ability to grow. Here you've got the plot right here of the single-seeded acorns. They grow longer leaves, they grow higher. Whereas the 2-seeded acorns grow just a little bit shorter, have a little bit shorter leaves. When siblings are growing together like that, they're competing for resources. And so there's been fairly strong selection for single-seeded acorns. Okay, the point of these acorns though, right? The point of the acorns is to get all this food from the mother tree into a package that her seeds, her offspring, can use. So when we look at those, if you've broken up an acorn before and you see inside all that white stuff in there, that's all called the cotyledons. Those are the seed leaves. They're full of food packed in there by the mother tree. That food is there for 2 reasons. One is to feed the seedling as it grows. The other one is to entice blue jays, squirrels, and other potential seed dispersers to move those seeds around. So when you look at the cotyledons or the acorn growing here on the ground, what you're seeing is all these resources from the mother tree being poured into the baby plant rapidly. But those resources are available for animals to eat as well. So how does the mother tree balance between making sure there's food for her offspring and making sure that there's food for the seed dispersers so that they're enticed to move those seeds around? Well, one thing is that when this root begins to grow, she moves nutrients into that root really rapidly. Now, usually we see the root coming out of the bottom of the acorn, off the styler end of the acorn. In some acorns, it actually comes out of the top, just as a side note. This is in the Cyclobalanopsis group. You're probably not going to get to see this unless you travel in the east looking for acorns. But when they begin to move those, when she moves those resources into the seedling, those resources become less available to the plant, to the acorn predators, right? So she basically makes the seed palatable for a short amount of time in order to get that seed moved around, and that gets those nutrients into her plants. So that food packed into the shell makes the acorn desirable. She has to balance this desire to get food to her offspring with desire to get the seeds around, because many of these seed predators are actually not that beneficial, like seed weevils. So the major defenses that acorns use: one is tannic acids. Two, relocating nutrients into the palatable roots, like we saw just a moment ago. Three, moving cotyledons away from the seedling as it begins to grow. Four, tolerating a little bit of herbivory. And finally, masting. So what do all of these mean? We'll go through each one of them in turn. The first is tannins. We've all worn leather or seen leather or utilized leather. Tannins are used by humans to preserve. They're used as flavorings. They're used to make dyes. Tannins are a really harsh chemical that bind to proteins and make proteins relatively undigestible. Every acorn is suffused in tannins, and the mother tree creates a tannin gradient. So there's a heavy dose of tannins up here at the tip of the acorn where her baby's growing tips, where the root and the shoot will begin to grow, and less tannins down here at the base, where if a mouse nibbles this part of the seed, it won't hurt the baby seedling at all. So if you take a look at the distribution of tannins as well as oils, lipids that are good for animals to eat, what you find is that the lipids are concentrated underneath the cap, so that a squirrel that picks up an acorn will preferentially tend to eat at the base underneath the cap. Same with the blue jay, same with the mouse, same with a weevil. And they'll tend to avoid the tip where the tannins are concentrated and where the growing tips of those baby plants are. So that's the first trick that the acorn uses, is the tannins. The second one we talked about already. As the acorn begins to grow, it shoves the nutrients from the cotyledons into the roots. The cotyledons are delicious to a mouse. The roots are not, because they're so full of cellulose, they can't digest them as easily. The third trick that they use is, as the plant begins to grow, it pushes those cotyledons away from the seed. Right? There's a stalk that pushes those cotyledons away, so that if a mouse comes along and says, "Oh, I'm kind of hungry, I'd like to nibble on this cotyledon," it can do so, but it's not going to hurt that seedling that's growing, because already the cotyledon's been pushed away from the seedling. The fourth trick is that acorns will actually tolerate a fair amount of herbivory. You can take, for instance, this is Quercus insignis. This is the acorn of the largest acorned oak in the world. It grows in the cloud forests of Mexico and Central America. If you take one of these Quercus insignis acorns, about that big around, you can cut away as much as a third of the cotyledon, and that seed will grow just fine at a good clip with no harm. So basically what the mother tree is doing is giving extra nutrients that her seedling will not even need, so just to entice those seed eaters. And finally, when everything comes together, all the trees in a population are flowering at the same time, they mast. And what masting is, it's the production of massive amounts of seed in irregular years, not every other year, not every 3 years, to saturate the market, so to speak. So what we're looking at here is a bed of oak seedlings in France. This is all Quercus robur, the pedunculate oak seedlings in France, a couple of years after a mast, where all these acorns have fallen, and you're seeing so many seeds growing on the ground because there were more acorns than the squirrels or the jays could possibly eat. We find the same thing in oaks around the world. This is a nice Quercus gregii shrub in Tamaulipas, collected in October 2022. It was a mast year. The thing is just dripping with acorns. Eastern white oak in our area. This is an area where we had a mast in 2023. And we found white oak seedlings the next year growing about 12 to 18 seedlings per square foot. Simply there because they produced so many acorns that the squirrels, the jays, couldn't possibly keep up. So how do oaks do this? Some years are really, really good for pollen production. And in years where there's great pollen production and years where there's great flowering intensity, all the oaks of a given species in an area flower together. And at that time, there's so much pollen available that they produce tons and tons of acorns. Second thing is that if they have masted in a given year, they gobble up their resources so they can't mast the next year. So when you put these things together, the use of available resources and the weather, which is unpredictable, it means that mice and squirrels can't track these masting events. So acorn production is basically unpredictable. This means that acorns are a suboptimal resource for the squirrels. If you just had the populations going like this of the acorns, the squirrels and the mice would just track those populations. And what you would see is that the oaks would get no benefits. So you put these all together, and what oaks are doing is creating a resource that's useful to the squirrels, useful to the jays, useful to the weevils, useful to the mice, but unreliable enough and difficult enough to digest that they don't all get devoured. So basically, the oaks are fooling the squirrels, the jays, into planting their acorns for them. Now, as a consequence, the squirrels have evolved to respond to oaks. They've gotten very, very good at dealing with oaks. They know how to discern an oak seed that's useful to them from one that's not useful to them. So an oak seed that has a weevil in it, right? Suppose a weevil gets into an oak seed. This happens quite often. If a squirrel picks that up and buries that oak seed, he or she is wasting their time, because that oak seed is going to be devoured by the weevil. So what the squirrels have figured out is that they can discern whether there's a weevil in an acorn by manipulating it with their paws. They feel it, they're like, is there something shaking around in there? Is it kind of light? If they're uncertain, they'll take the acorn in their teeth and they'll shake it like that and see how heavy it is. Like if you took a grapefruit in your mouth and shook it, it would feel much heavier to you than if you took a wiffle ball in your mouth and shook it. They do exactly the same thing. And in this way, they discern, like, if that acorn is starting to get eaten by weevils, they throw it away or they eat it right away. But if not, they may bury it, because that one stands a chance of getting through the winter and giving them resources in the midwinter. Second thing they can do, is that my phone or somebody else's? Okay, thank you. I was worried I'd left my phone on. The second thing they do is they've gotten to be pretty good oak taxonomists, kind of good oak taxonomists. They can tell red oaks from white oaks. Now, there's still like, over 100 red oak species, over 100 white oak species. So they're not great taxonomists, but they're pretty good. And the reason this matters is that oak seeds that fall in the autumn don't typically germinate until the next year. So they're safe to cache underground. White oak seeds that fall on the ground typically germinate that fall. And remember what happens to the nutrients in the cotyledons when it germinates? The nutrients pour into the roots and become relatively unuseful to the squirrels. So squirrels can discern whether they're looking at a red oak or a white oak, partially by smell, partially by the surface, the texture of the surface lets or doesn't let odors through. If they've got a white oak, they tend to eat those right away. If they've got a red oak, they tend to disperse them or bury them. Another thing that squirrels will do with white oaks is white oaks that they want to cache, they will flip over, go to the styler end, the business end, where the root is going to come out, and they'll nip the tip off. The base, I know, it's a dirty trick. So they get rid of the baby, and then they'll cache the remaining cotyledon. Not always. The year that I finished this book, I went out to Eastwoods, and every acorn that I saw on the ground was a partially eaten red oak, not a white oak. I don't know. They don't always read the books. So in doing all this, squirrels are dispersing acorns pretty well, on the order of 50 to 100 meters. This is just the home range of a few squirrels that Michael Steele studied. If you're interested in this stuff, read Michael Steele's book, Oak Seed Dispersal. I read this not once, but twice. It's that good. But that's not going to be enough dispersal distance to really get seeds where they need to go. So a far more reliable long-distance disperser are the jays. Blue jays will go up, or gray jays and Mexican jays will go up into the trees. They will take acorns one by one, stick them in their cheeks, right? Take one in their bill. They'll fly off 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, disgorge these seeds onto the ground, and then peck them singly into the ground. This is called scatter hoarding. It's the same thing that squirrels do, burying their acorns one by one, sort of away from where others might find them. In so doing, they're getting acorns to where they're protected from dry environments so that they'll be less likely to desiccate, and also protecting them from other predators. As a consequence, where you go worldwide looking at oak distributions, you also tend to find this hash mark. This is a rough map of oak distributions worldwide. You also find jays. They're co-located almost worldwide. And jay dispersals go much further than squirrel dispersals. The longest dispersals that we have for jays are on the order of 7 to 10 kilometers, much larger than we expect to see with squirrels. So dispersal is really a balance between provisioning acorns for the next generation and manipulating seed dispersers. So in this way, oaks, squirrels, jays really collaborate in planting the forest that we see, but oaks are kind of leading the charge. Now, when you put all this dispersal together, repeated year after year, you get migration. We know that as the glaciers receded beginning about 20,000 years ago, oaks had to migrate northward, and they moved fairly fast. Oaks migrated an estimated 500 to 1,000 meters per year in Europe following glaciation. This is estimates of oak distributions, oak abundance, based on pollen records in Europe following the last glacial maximum. These velocities are estimated from pollen abundance alone, maybe a little bit high if these northern oak outposts were actually important to the spread of the species. In eastern North America, oaks likely migrate northward at average rates closer to 100 to 130 meters per year. Thank you very much. So put this all together. You get dispersal and reproduction. These processes bind individuals into populations and species. These individual interactions then scale up to form the migration dynamics and interactions among species at the scale of sites and landscapes. And then these species dynamics shape selective environments, influencing the evolution of species. Okay, so that's part one. So part two, when and where did oaks evolve? This is work that we've been working on for the last decade and a half with a group of collaborators. Paul Manos, Janine Kavanagh-Barris, Jean Romero-Severson, myself, and Antonio Gonzalez-Rodriguez teamed up beginning in 2010 to write a proposal to basically track the evolution of the American oaks, trying to understand where did the North American oaks come from, where did the Mexican oaks come from, how do we explain all the convergence and diversity that we see in North America's oaks. But as we got into this work, our collaborative group grew and grew and grew. And so what you're going to see is really the story of the oaks of the world writ large, and it's a huge group of collaborators that we've worked with over the course of the last few years. But in brief, 56 million years ago, right? Oaks evolved. There they are. They're embedded in the beech family with a group of really interesting nut-bearing species, the chinkapins, the tan oaks. These guys are restricted to California today. This one is a single species in a single genus that's sister to all of the oaks. Chinkapins, 2 or 3 species, depending on how you chop them up. Closely related to the stone oaks, lithocarps, which have 320 species. So it's these little clusters of species, these cluster of genera that all evolved together at a very hot time in the world's history. Oaks arose at a time when the world was mostly tropical, in high latitude forests or mid latitude, what we call the boreotropics, where you had a mix of species that we never find growing together. Broad-leaved evergreen species, with true tropical species, with species that would become the antecedents of today's boreal species. If you look at the distribution of oak fossils, the earliest oak fossils for different lineages that we know today. The turkey and the cork oaks that are today distributed only in Eurasia. The ring-cupped oaks limited to East Asia. The earliest known white oak way up here in Axel Heiberg Island. The earliest known intermediate oak over here in Greenland. This group is only known from California now. The earliest known deer and red oaks. These all go back to like 40 to 45 or 48 million years ago. This tells us that within just a few million years, oaks radiated to produce a lot of the morphological diversity that we see today. So when we look at the oaks of the world, we see things like the turkey oaks, the Quercus ilex, the ring-cupped oaks in the old world. And in the new world, things like the white oaks, the red oak group, the intermediate, the deer cup, and the live oaks. These groups evolved very early, and they evolved in a geographically structured way. Because this group is almost exclusively limited to the Americas, this group to the Old World. So what we're looking at is, first of all, the deepest split in the oak phylogeny is this split between the continents. At a time when a mammal could have walked from North America over to Europe at about 50 million years ago, the oaks were splitting into these two big groups. The continents, as they were drifting apart, created these two lineages separately. As temperatures were cooling and the continents were drifting apart, oaks migrated south and filled the area where these broad-leaved evergreen forests were slowly being extirpated as temperatures cooled. And broad-leaved evergreen forests were being shoved up against the Gulf and being driven extinct or pushed down into Mexico. At about 33 million years ago, the lobed leaves that we recognize as being iconic of Eastern North American oaks, those evolved only about 33 million years ago. So following this ancient divergence between the Old World and the Americas, oaks evolved more or less independently in Eurasia and the Americas. The American story is more familiar to us. American oaks split early on into 5 lineages, of which 2 dominate. The white oaks, so things like eastern white oak, fir oak, swamp white oak, post oak, and the red oaks. Things like northern red oak, scarlet oak, hills oak, black oak. In both groups, in both the red oaks and the white oaks, we see an early split between the Californian oaks and the Eastern North American oaks, radiating simultaneously. The Eastern North American oaks moving down into Mexico in both the red oak group and the white oak group. And then in the white oak group, one lineage moving back to Eurasia. What we're looking at here then is over the course of a few million years, 10 to 20 million years, oaks fill up the Americas in parallel, both the white oaks and the red oaks simultaneously radiating at the same time, both beginning in the far north, moving south down into the Rocky Mountains. As the Rocky Mountains lift up, the Eastern North American species are split from the Western North American species. And then in about 20 million years, each one of those groups sends a lineage down into Mexico and Mesoamerica. So oaks headed into Mexico and Eurasia by different routes about 25 or 20 million years ago. This move at the northern edge of the continent was particularly fascinating because it's one single white oak population that dispersed via either the North Atlantic land bridge back to Europe or the Bering land bridge back to East Asia at about 20 million years ago. This single population would found the Eurasian white oaks, which today number about 20 species, 20 to 25 species. White oaks that reached Eurasia exchanged genes with a solitary species, this Quercus pontica, that looks like this. This is a species that today is known only from the Caucasus. Every species of Eurasian white oak carries genes from this one species, Quercus pontica, indicating that there was a very early gene exchange from Quercus pontica into the ancestor of all of the Eurasian white oaks, which may explain part of their success as they covered Europe. If you're interested in hybridization, that'll be the topic of tomorrow's lecture. Once they got to Southeast Asia, the white oaks encountered a whole mess of other oaks. And despite that fact, they did extremely well. They encountered the ring-cupped oaks of section Cyclobalanopsis, which had really flourished in the broad-leaved evergreen forests as the Himalayas were rising. They encountered the cork oaks of section Ceres, which had arisen in Northeast Asia by that point and dispersed westward across Europe and southward across East Asia. And they encountered the holly oaks, section Ilex, which had arisen in East Asia, spread westward along the continent, across the continent, along the southern edge of the Himalayas to fill up the Mediterranean. So the white oaks get over to Europe and they find a completely oak-filled continent. And despite this fact, the white oaks dominate. The white oaks produce like this 25 species, and today the white oaks span the northern hemisphere. If you look at this map of oak distributions, everywhere where you see hash marks going this way, that's white oaks. So right, North America, bum, 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 bum. Europe, doom, 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 doom. East Asia, doom, 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 doom. Anywhere in the world where you see oaks, you find white oaks, with a couple of exceptions. One, deep Southeast Asia here, and two, Colombia. Those are the only two areas. Okay, so that's going on at the north. Meanwhile, the most exciting thing in Mexico. The world's oak diversity lives in Mexico. Today, there's like 425 oak species worldwide, 160 of them by an estimate 20 years ago. Susana Valencia just gave a lecture about a month ago. She says there's 187 species in Mexico. So it's a lot, and it's growing by the minute. This is another collaboration that's been going on for a long time, would not be possible without a lot of collaborators across North America and Mexico. But the brief story is that oaks moved down to Mexico from eastern North American ancestors twice, once in the red oaks, once in the white oaks at about 20 million years. When they do, they move down through Texas, drop off some species in Texas, move down the Sierra Madre Oriental into the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt. Don't worry, in the paper, this will be a nicer map. They move down into, they will, it's done. They move down into southern Mexico and Central America, and then they diversify northward along the western mountains. This happens from roughly 20 million years ago till about 5 million years ago in both the white oaks and the red oaks. So remember that story that we told earlier where the white oaks and the red oaks are filling up North America, north of Mexico? They did the same thing in Mexico, right? So they're basically double dipping as they conquer this continent. So as they do so, they peel out a lot of really wonderful diversity. This is a species that appears to be Quercus tarahumara in Sonora, Quercus absinthica, also in Sonora from the same trip. The white oaks, Quercus arizonica, which if you looked at this from a distance, looks like just a normal white oak in our area, but it looks rather different when you look at it up close. And a savanna that looks just like one of our white oak savannas. And Quercus rugosa with this wonderful, deeply colored pair of cotyledons inside the acorns. And even as they make their way back up the Sierra Madre Occidental, dropping one species off in California. Quercus engelmannii, if any of you have been to Southern California botanizing, Quercus engelmannii is a range-restricted species of southernmost Southern California. It is a Mexican oak by origin that arose, do I have the pictures here? No, that arose by Quercus oblongifolia, which is a Sierra Madre Occidental species, rising up here, spreading out into California. As climates changed during the Pleistocene, this population over here in Southern California got isolated and survived there, in part, we believe, because it exchanged genes with California white oaks. Today, it carries a ton of Quercus berbertifolia, California scrub white oak genes. Okay. This is a lot of information, friends. Now that I say it, this is an information-rich lecture. So I'll be around for questions afterwards. Final topic, how oaks shape the forest. So we've got oaks reproducing, migrating, filling space. We've got oaks evolving, filling the planet. You put these things together and they fill up our forests too. So how do they do this? Well, when we look at Oaks are disproportionately important to us. Like this Quercus muhlenbergii, chinkapin oak, this particular tree growing in Lexington is called the Great God Tree, because when you stand under it, you say, Great God. It's huge. The massiveness of oaks influences how important they are in our ecosystem. They bind up a lot of carbon, whether they're these massive broad trees or these massive tall old trees like this 330-year-old Quercus petrea in northern France. That wood is important to us economically. We make wine barrels, previously sailing ships out of it. Oaks are coppiced to make charcoal. And oaks feed us. Oaks feed the animals as well. In addition to growing above ground, they fill space below ground, depending on the species. Some of them are strongly rhizomatous, like the myrtle oak or the sand live oak. And in fact, the oldest known oak in the world, Quercus palmeri, is a single clone estimated at 13,000 years old. It's been sitting there as temperatures rose and it's become completely isolated, out of place right now, growing clonally year by year, no longer having the opportunity to reproduce. Oak's oversized effect on the world is due in part to this massiveness, which gives insects and acorn eaters like squirrels and jays and mice a lot to live on, fungi, but also their diversity matters. More species of oaks mean they have more ways of shaping ecosystems. This is a figure from some Janine Cavender-Barris's work, showing, first of all, if you look at oaks, at woody plants in Mexico and the US, oaks dominate in biomass among all the genera, and they dominate in number of species among all the woody plant genera in both Mexico and the US. And if you just look at diversity here, you can see there's areas of the country where you can find more than 20 species of oaks growing together. This high diversity means that as oaks fill the continent, evolving in parallel, the white oaks and the red oaks, they fill the same areas of geographic space, right? So we have white oaks and red oaks of Eastern North America, white oaks and red oaks of California, white oaks and red oaks of Mexico, but comparable habitats. So we find white oaks and red oaks of dry, fire-prone systems, white oaks and red oaks of bottomland forests. This ecological diversity means that there's so many species in a given area that the insects, the fungi, have a lot to choose from if they need different resources. So when we go into a forest today, this is a forest near my home, Blackwell Forest Preserve. You walk in there, and without spending more than 2 minutes at it, I can find bur oak, eastern white oak, northern red oak, and Hills oak, 4 species, and that's a split of more than 40 million years. If I stand with my hand on an eastern white oak here and my hand on a Hills oak right over here, which I can do very easily, I'm spanning 40 million years of evolutionary history. That's a ton of time for different traits to evolve, for different insects to become adapted to different chemistry of different trees, right? This phenomenon of convergence between lineages, such that red oaks and white oaks of the same forest may look very deeply lobed and rather similar in our forests, whereas red oaks and white oaks outside Michoacán, Mexico, look very similar to each other with these small, very fuzzy leaves. They're similar to each other, not because they're closely related, but because there's been strong selection for traits that adapt white oaks and red oaks of Eastern North America to their unique habitats, white oaks and red oaks of montane Mexico to their habitats. That's convergence. That history of traits evolving on the tree of life have accounted for this variety of ecosystems. So this oak diversity really shapes forest understory communities, the mammal and bird communities that depend on oaks. There's some kind of peromyscus running along here. And fungal communities, including chanterelles and the fungi that live on leaves. Oaks shape insect communities as well. Most remarkably, the gall wasps, whose young grow up inside of oaks. So I'll show just a couple of stories, one being of gall wasps and one being of mycorrhizal fungi. This is research that we're conducting with our colleague Ian Pierce with USGS at Fort Collins Science Center. Ian has been studying the gall wasps of Eastern North American oaks in association with some genomic work that we've been doing. So gall wasps are wasps that lay their eggs inside of plants, right, and cause the plant to grow a home for their babies. There's a whole lineage of gall wasps that are specialized on oaks. So here's one where the mother wasp has come along, she's stuck her ovipositor into the branch of this Quercus sapotifolia and said, basically, she hijacks the oak's genes and says, build a home for my baby. And the oak does so. And inside that gall, there's a whole mass of spongy tissue, some of which will be eaten by the gall insect inside, this little guy right here, and some of which will just produce a buffer around him or her. And the reason for that is that there are parasites that go after these gall wasps and try and lay their eggs inside the galls, inside these insects. Ian's crew in the fall of 2022 and 2023 covered a lot of the range of bur oak. These are sites where we had collected bur oaks and done some genomic work. Ian covered the vast majority of this area, including some sites down here that aren't on this map, in search of galls. At each site, Gabe Ribicoff and the rest of his crew used pole pruners to get branches. They got galls that they could then bring back into the lab and rear. And they counted the morphology. They surveyed the morphology of the galls on the trees. Things like just a few of the species that they found that we regularly find on bur oak and closely related white oaks. All of these are different galls produced by different gall wasp species. By surveying these galls and then rearing out the insects in the lab, which was the project of Leah Samuels, who was working with Ian in our lab for a year, they could determine what the wasp was inside the gall. This, in this case, was Dishelcapsis quercus mama, which comes from these little bullet galls that you find on Quercus macrocarpa. And sometimes what parasites were growing in there along with them. This was a parasitoid, long ovipositor designed specifically to burrow in through the gall and lay an egg on the actual gall wasp larva itself. So what things has he found so far? First, oak species, what species you are, affects both how many different gall species you have and how many galls you produce. So we talked earlier about the diversity of oak species providing diverse resources for insects and fungi. This is case in point. The number of oak species in the forest are going to influence how many different gall species that forest can support. The second thing is that the communities of gall makers, here we have the oak evolutionary history over here, differ from one oak species to next, and they track evolutionary history to a certain extent. So here we have communities of galls where the similarity between the gall communities is represented by how close they are on this tree. And the relatedness between the oak species is indicated by their closeness on this tree. And what you find is that close oak relatives often share similar gall wasp communities. This is to say that oak evolutionary history influences the gall communities that we find today. Okay, so that's above ground. Below ground, at the same time, oaks are shaping fungal communities. So this is work that's being led by Peter Kennedy and his postdoc, Kathleen Thompson. They also visited these sites where we had genotyped trees, and they surveyed the fungal communities on the roots of those trees, looking for two different kinds of fungi. One is ectomycorrhizal fungi, mycorrhizal fungi that live on the outsides of the roots, and arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi that penetrate the roots. and some trees are dually colonized. The importance of mycorrhizal fungi is that mycorrhizal fungi will forage for nutrients and receive carbon from the tree in return. So they pass nutrients on to the tree passes carbon along to the fungus. And so you expect a tight evolutionary relationship between them. Some are generalists, some are specialists on different species. And so they were asking questions about what abiotic factors, what aspects of climate and soil influence the fungi, and what biotic factors, whether oak evolutionary history, oak genetics, and the neighboring tree community affected the mycorrhizal fungi. They sampled roots and soil from 30 sites, sequenced them to find out what fungi they were carrying. And the punchlines were, first of all, most sites had numerous fungal species. So what you're looking at here, each column is a site that they visited, and each row is one genus of fungus that they found by sequencing those roots. And so they find when they look at the ectomycorrhizal fungi and the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, much higher diversity of ectomycorrhizal fungi, the ones that live on the surface of the on the outside of the roots that make a mantle. Things like brittle gills, things like stinking earth fan, the jellied false coral fungus, a lot of these things that we see in the woods that we walk right past and we may not even think like, what's their function? All of these are mycorrhizal fungi that are living in symbiosis with the tree. So the punchline, when they looked at the ectomycorrhizal fungal oak communities, ectomycorrhizal communities on the oaks, they found that those were more diverse than the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungal communities. The second thing that they found is that the forest community, how many tree species were growing with the oaks, strongly influenced the richness of the ectomycorrhizal fungal community. That was not the case with the arbuscular mycorrhizal community. And the third thing they're finding, and this is all preliminary data, but that the ectomycorrhizal fungal communities vary depending on the host oak species in hybridization. So what you're looking at here, this is a two-dimensional representation of all of the pairwise differences between mycorrhizal communities. Each of these small dots is one mycorrhizal community on one tree, and the colors represent what species they are. What you see is these big centroids, these squares, are in different positions. This gives us an idea that the average community for species is different. The overlap in communities is very high, but there are some important differences between species. So when you put all of these processes together, you get a picture of oak reproduction shaping species, which shape and are shaped by forest interactions, things we're just looking at last. And these in turn shape and are shaped by evolution of oaks on the tree of life. So it's this understanding of reproduction and natural history, of forest ecology, and of evolutionary history. When you put those together, you really begin to get an understanding of oaks as cohesive organisms that sort of span the globe. And this is important because while the oak genus is going to be here for a long, long time, individual species are at risk. There's more than 425 species worldwide. Of those, an estimated 30% are at risk of extinction by climate, diseases and pests, habitat loss. Their ability to survive is really going to depend on what we do and on their own evolutionary and ecological strengths. So this picture of oaks from all these dimensions, this is really the theme of oak origins. And my hope is that as you're in the forest, you begin to see the oak from all these different dimensions. And acknowledging this, I could not do this work without a lot of support from a lot of colleagues. Writing this book was an independent project, but the research underlying it has been going on for about 2 decades with collaborators around the world, with a lot of financial and logistical support, with my current colleagues on our Eastern North American bur oak research, and my lab group, including Rebecca Moen, class of 2017, Miami University there, who's our postdoc on the bur oak work. And rest assured, Rebecca is doing fantastic work. Thank you all. I'd be happy to take questions.
Repeat questions when we get them.
Okay, sounds good. Yes.
What was first oak that you actually studied that made you want to focus on oak tree?
So the question was, what was the first oak tree I ever studied that made me want to study oak trees? And it was the oak that's featured on the cover of the book. It's this Quercus ellipsoidalis. This is Hill's oak. It's a real, I hope you're getting all this. Okay, let's see. It's this one right here. And why this guy right here? This is a wonderful oak tree. So a widespread oak species that you guys have out here is scarlet oak, Quercus coccinea. Quercus coccinea was long believed to be all over eastern North America, but in 1899, Reverend E.J. Hill describes a species from southern Cook County, which is in right out part of Chicago. It's Quercus, what is now known as ellipsoidalis. Quercus ellipsoidalis is a western Great Lakes endemic, and when I started my job at the Arboretum, I didn't know anything about oaks except what I knew as a naturalist. And I had to start working on woody plants because I was working at Arboretum. And my buddy, Marlon Bowles, said, you should work on Hill's oak because we don't know what's going on with that. And it turned out to be so interesting and so exciting and introduced me to hybridization and to the nature of species and to walking around the woods with pole pruners and to the world of acorns. So it was Hill's oak. Yes.
So the story of the American oak colonizing Mexico and coming back to Western North America is great, and I understand how the DNA gives you those phylogenetic trees, so you know who are the close relatives. But how do you know where each of these species was 10 or 20 million years ago? Are there enough fossils that say this species was in this location 10 or 20 million years ago?
Great. That's a great question. For most things we can't. We know from the molecular data that most species were probably not even in existence that long ago. But we do have some fossil data in California that gives us ideas about species persistence over time. And there are some species that we can document that have lived been in the mountains, and in the mountains and westward for upwards of 8 million years. So in some cases we can track them. But when you look at the fossil data indicating where species were at what time, those fossil species, it's really hard to say that they are identical to today's species. What we can do a good job of, though, is we can model using estimates of paleoclimate and fossil pollen records and knowledge about where species occur today. We can model where species were in the past. So there's been some really good work combining molecular data with paleoclimate data to model where species were persisting during the last glacial maximum, when the glacier was at its furthest south during the Ice Age at about 20,000 years ago. People can model that reasonably well. There's even some large uncertainty on that. But we don't, for the vast majority of species, we can't say, oh, here's where white oak was, and here's how long that's been in existence. But we can pin down the divergence time that says this ancestral population gave rise to, to bur oak this way, and to swamp white oak, and overcup oak this way. Does that make sense? So it's kind of, that's my long way of saying we don't know. It's kind of fuzzy, and our capacity to trace things that precisely is low. Other questions, concerns? Yes. That's a great, so the question was, what kind of fossils are we finding and how can we tell they're oaks? So the majority of the fossil work that I referred to today is done by my colleague, Thomas Dank. And what Thomas works on extensively, this is Thomas right here, Thomas has done an awful lot of work with fossil pollen. He's become extremely adept at working with fossil pollen, which is great. Our very first oak fossil, sorry, is off the map. It's over here in Austria, is 56 million years ago. And it's a collection of pollen from a road cut near, along a trail south of a church. And all you've got is the pollen. So for sure you can tell that it's an oak. Now, what Thomas has done is he and a couple of his collaborators have looked at modern day pollen and been able to ascertain that some of the lineages of modern day oaks, they can tell what they can distinguish those pollen grains. So then they can go back to the fossil record and actually say, okay, we know what lineages we have from the fossil pollen. We have some macrofossils, leaves, but not as many as we would like. This white oak fossil up here, this is a leaf. And it's a leaf that looks like a Eurasian white oak with sort of shallowly scalloped leaves. The timing rules out it being a Eurasian white oak. So it's a white oak of some kind. This fossil over here of ring-cupped oak, this is actually an acorn. It's the impression of an acorn, but it's ambiguous enough that when I say possibly here, it's because it looks like it's either a ring-cupped oak or it's a lithocarp, a stone oak, which is a different genus altogether, closely related. So with the fossil data, you have such tantalizing information. It's so exciting, but you're always like, I'm certain it's this here or it's this over here. And it feels that way all the time. And so it really requires a lot of careful work and collaboration. And Thomas is wonderful to work with because he's careful and thoughtful and humble. And he goes back and says, I said that one time, but the more I've learned, the more I think that might not have been correct. And so it's really wonderful working with someone who gets the fossils that well, because it takes a lot of work. Which is, I think that's another way of saying, I don't know. But that's sort of the level of certainty that we have. Yes. Yes.
So there's quite a bit of diversity in the acorn shapes and sizes and so on. Do we know anything about the selective pressures that are shaping the diversity within the oaks? And then I have a second completely unrelated question.
Can I do the first one first? Okay, so the first question was, so there's so much diversity in oak forms, shapes, sizes. Do we know anything about the selective pressure driving adaptation of oaks? And the answer is we know for some features. There's been some work, for instance, on the trade-off between tannins and shell thickness in response to insect herbivory. That's literally the only study I can think of. But I'm sure there's a lot. There's others out there, but that's the one that I can think of. Yeah. So there's probably a lot more to be done. But things like when you look at the acorn, people are always like, okay, the acorn cap, is that an adaptation to fire? Maybe, but there's a lot of fire-adapted oaks, and their acorn caps are all over the place. Yeah. And then you had a second question. No.
Expert, if I go orange, is there a good character that allows me to distinguish between red oaks and white oaks?
What a good question. So the question is, so you've got these two major lineages, the red oak group and the white oak group. Is there something I can use to distinguish between those two? And there are a few characteristics. So are we thinking just Eastern North America? Or are we thinking everywhere? Okay, let's go ideally everywhere. Okay, so if you know it's a red oak or a white oak, look at the margin of the leaf and look to see if there's any points where there's like a potential for a bristle to form. Is a bristle forming? And if a bristle is forming, then you probably have a red oak, because white oaks generally don't produce these aristae or bristles. Now, once in a while, you'll get one that's ambiguous. It's a little hard to tell. Hope that you have an acorn. Go crack open the acorn and look at the inner surface of the acorn shell. The inner surface of the acorn shell on a black oak is going to be fuzzy. The inner surface of the acorn shell on a white oak is going to be smooth. So that's a nice character. A third character is, you remember I showed that picture of the Mexican white oak savanna, and we're driving past and I said, oh, look, it looks just like a savanna. If you see the bark looking kind of white, look at that white flaky bark. That's like the white oak look. You can be fooled. You could be fooled, but that's I could be fooled. But that flakiness of the bark is real common in white oaks, whereas the red oak bark tends to be a little blockier. But I think that acorn character is really good. And if you have the aristy, see, look at those, red oak or white oak, my friends. Red oak, exactly. This is one that's just screaming at you like, I'm a red oak. But you don't always see it that well. This also is a red oak. Sorry. Other questions, comments, concerns? Yes.
Is there any growth pattern or the oaks? What's the competition?
Great question. Let me say, okay, so the question was after a mast year 2023, 2024, 12 to 18, seeds per square foot or whatever. Like what's the selection like after that? Is that what you're asking? And let me answer, I'll give an answer and see if I'm answering the right question. The attrition looks like this, like within the first decade after a mast year, you lose about 95% of those acorns. A lot of those seedlings die off. So if you look at if you were surveying, and someone did this, there's a great paper, Ethel 2022, where they surveyed the genomes of trees that had grown up in a cohort 320 years ago, another cohort's like 100 years ago. They said the allele frequencies of that cohort that grew up like 300 years ago, those were all selected within about a 10-year period, because they know that all that selection happened in that first decade. So you get like 95% selected in that first decade. I think by the end of the second decade, it's roughly 98% have been selected away. Is that the question you were asking? Okay. And I don't know, I don't want to cut into people's evening. Why don't we do one more question, and then I'll stick around and I'll be in the reception for other questions. One last question, concern, comment?
Quite a funny story. Quick,
I'd love to hear it.
talked to my 82-year-old sister the other night. Lives in West Virginia, in a mature oak forest. Lovely. Cracked house built 1965. I said, how you doing, Faith? She said, I can't get to sleep at night. I said, oh my gosh, but there's too much coffee? She said, no. There's just these acorns pounding on the roof all night long. She said, I'm walking the sidewalk and people are getting broken ankles or falling. I said, you got a match here, don't you? Well, what do you call it? There are lots of acorns.
Please join us for the reception, right back there.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. That's okay. They still went through just fine. So you're fine.